250 years. That's how long this republic has stood. 250 years since 56 men picked up a quill pen, signed their names to a document, and in doing so pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to an idea. An idea that did not come from a king, did not come from Parliament, did not come from a philosopher sitting in some European drawing room. It came from a conviction, deeply, unapologetically biblical, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with rights that no government can give and no government can take away. So here's the question I want to spend this series asking, and it's not a comfortable one. Did we keep it? 250 years later, did we keep what they built?
Welcome to the What's Important Now broadcast. In America today, we are witnessing a cultural shift. This is the show devoted to the battle for the soul of our country. Join our host, Tom Sears, as he explains the issues of our day, and join the fight to bring values and morality back. Let's join Tom now as he shares What's Important Now.
Welcome to What's Important Now. I'm Tom Sears, and this is episode 1 of a 4-part series that I'm calling 250 Years. Did we keep the Republic? And we're going to dive deep into America's founding, its Christian heritage, and then where we are today and, well, what we can expect as it relates to the next 250 years if we can get there. But also, I want to encourage you to check out legacylivingmedia.com and follow our podcast. Make sure that you're visiting Spreaker or Apple iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcast at. Make sure that you like and subscribe and then share with someone. So I want to start today where I think every serious conversation about America has to start. And that's with those who actually started this nation, to find out who these individuals actually were. Because if you've sat through a history class in the last 20 years, the truth is, in many cases, it's not always the case. There's a pretty good chance, though, that you've been handed a version of the Founding Fathers that's been scrubbed, sanitized, and then stripped of the very thing that made them remarkable. I was recently watching, I continue to watch, actually, it's multiple episodes of, various documentaries about the Founding Fathers. And as I'm watching it, it's like the people talking are doing everything they can to paint these individuals as bad people. But let me ask you something. When was the last time you heard someone describe George Washington as a man of deep, sincere Christian faith? When did you last see curriculum that quoted John Adams when he said, and I'm going to read this one carefully because I want to get it right. He said that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people, and that it is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. You know why that quote makes people nervous? It's because it tells you the whole system, the entire system, only works if the people inside of it have a conscience. A real one, not one constructed culturally or that comes from somewhere else. The founders knew exactly where it came from. Now, I know that some folks will say, Tom, many of the founders were deists. They didn't believe in a personal God. Jefferson cut the miracles out of his Bible. And yes, okay, you win. Some of them wrestled. Some of them doubted. The founders were human beings, not stained glass window saints. But here's what nobody tells you in this deist narrative. Benjamin Franklin, the one they always trot out as the skeptic of the bunch, he stood up in the Constitutional Convention in 1787 when that gathering was about to fall apart, and he said this. He called for prayer, and then he said, "I have lived a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men." He then quoted Psalm 127, except in order to paint the whole picture, we have to understand what he said was from Psalms 127, verse 1, when he said, "Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain." That was Benjamin Franklin, the deist. Patrick Henry, George Mason, Samuel Adams, John Witherspoon, by the way, was a Presbyterian minister who signed the Declaration of Independence. Roger Sherman. These were not men who had a vague, impersonal relationship with a clockmaker. These were men that were formed, and some would say forged, by Scripture, shaped by the sermons of the Black Robe Regiment. Men who believed that providence, not politics, not military genius, and most assuredly not luck, that providence had brought this nation into being. You need to understand the context, because you cannot understand America without understanding that the founding generation believed that they were participants in something bigger that God was doing in history. Not something they dreamed up, but something God had ordained. In 2 Chronicles, let's try that again. Chronicles, 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14. The Bible says, "If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land." It's not a suggestion. That verse is not a suggestion. The founding fathers treated it like a contract. It was a covenant. And they built a republic on the assumption that the people governing themselves would honor that covenant. And that's what we've lost sight of today. And that's what this entire series, 4-part series to honor America's 250th birthday, that's what this whole series is going to be about. Now, the thing you have to know is that Providence was not an accident. I want to take you back to April 30th, 1789 in New York City. It is the very first inauguration of the very first president of the United States. And George Washington is standing on a balcony at Federal Hall on Wall Street. He places his hand on an open Bible. And this Bible is open to Genesis chapter 49 and 50. He takes the oath, and then he did something that no inauguration ceremony script ever required. He bowed his head, and then he prayed. And that's not it. And I've talked about this before. After that formal ceremony, the entire Congress, I'm talking the Senate and the House, they walked together down the streets of New York City to St. Paul's Chapel, right there in Lower Manhattan, and they held a 2-hour worship service. The first official act of the first official Congress of the United States was to go to church and pray. This is indisputable. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because the same people who want to tell you the founders intended a strict wall between religion and public life, they need to explain why the first thing the first Congress ever did was go to church. They need to explain that. Makes no sense. And the answer is simply because they understood something that we have already forgotten. They understood that self-government requires virtue, and that virtue is not present without morality. And morality, real morality, the kind that holds up under pressure, the kind that survives prosperity and suffering alike, that morality comes from a relationship with God. It was not a fringe view. It was a consensus. And then if you fast forward to John Adams, who's the second president, now he's not necessarily this fire and brimstone revivalist, but he wrote to the Massachusetts militia in 1798, and he said that without religion and morality, no government could survive. And he wasn't just talking about state-enforced religion. He was talking about a people that had been formed by faith. And then look at the very moment of independence itself, July 2nd, 1776, because the vote actually, by the way, happened on the 2nd. John Adams wrote to his wife, Abigail, that this day would be celebrated by future generations with pomp and ceremony, with bonfires and illuminations, and from one end of this continent to the other. And then he added, it ought to be solemnized with acts of devotion to God Almighty. I recently was watching a documentary about this. John Adams thought July 2nd would be the day, but it turns out it's July 4th. Hey, a couple of days off, but we still do celebrate it. But what we have forgot is the acts of devotion to God Almighty. And that's what John Adams thought Independence Day should be all about. So the question is, how far have we drifted away from that? In reality, we live in a moment where the 250th anniversary of independence is being celebrated with concerts and fireworks and government programs, all of which are fine, whatever. Nothing wrong with celebrating. But where is the devotion? Where is the acknowledgement that the nation that is turning 250 was built on the conviction that God still governs in the affairs of men? Again, not a political statement. It's a historical fact, and it's one we need to reclaim. There's a chapter of American history. It's been almost completely erased from public memory. And if I could, I want to spend just a few minutes bringing it back to life, because I believe it explains a lot. And it's the Black Robe Regiment. That's what the British called them. And it was meant to be an insult. It referred to the colonial pastors, the men in black robes who stood in their pulpits every Sunday and they preached the case and the cause of liberty. Political sermons, biblical arguments for self-government. They were theological frameworks, so to speak, and it makes the revolution not just thinkable, but their goal was to also make it righteous. Now, these pastors in this Black Robe Regiment, they were not just peripheral figures. They were central. Because at that time, the pulpit was the most influential media platform of the 18th century. And those preachers, those pastors who occupied those pulpits, they shaped the moral and theological imagination of an entire generation. Men like Jonathan Mayhew, who preached in 1750 a sermon called A Discourse Concerning Unlimited Submission and Non-Resistance to the Higher Powers. Now, this particular sermon argued directly from Romans chapter 13 that submission to tyranny was not a Christian virtue. James Otis Jr. said the sermon ignited the flame of American liberty. Men like John Peter Muhlenberg, who stood in his pulpit in Woodstock, Virginia on a Sunday morning in January of 1776, and he preached from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And of course, there is a time for every purpose under heaven, including a time for war. And then he threw off his clerical robes to reveal the uniform of the Continental Army underneath. He walked out of the church that day with 300 of his congregation, and they joined the fight. Men like Samuel Cooper, Jonas Clark, who was the pastor at the church in Lexington where the very first shots of the revolution were fired. The men who stood their ground at Lexington and Concord were formed by men like Jonas Clark. The revolution was not primarily a political event. It was a theological one. And when we forget that, we misunderstand the entire thing. Galatians 5:1 says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm, then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." You see, the founding generation had a theological case for liberty. I believe the church in America needs to rediscover that exact same case today, because the battle we're in right now is not primarily political. In fact, it is spiritual. Now, as we get into the second half of the program, I want to talk about something practical, because here's what I've learned after over 20 years of doing this. It's simply not enough to know history. You actually have to do something with it. But before I get to the practical, I want to camp out on something for a few minutes, because I don't think we fully felt the weight of what we've been talking about today. We've talked about the founder's faith. We've talked about Providence. We've talked about the Black Robe Regiment. And these are just some historical facts, hopefully interesting to you. And you can, as it relates to historical facts, you can collect them like trading cards. They are the story of how this nation came to exist. And if you don't know the story, and if your children do not know the story, then you are living in a house whose foundation you cannot see. And a foundation you cannot see is a foundation you cannot defend. So I want to spend a moment on the cost, because I think we've sanitized the revolution into something a little too clean, a little too distant. And we've put these men on these monuments that we can see in some of our cities, especially Washington, D.C., and on pedestals. And we forget that they were actually flesh and blood human beings who made a decision. And that decision, honestly, could have gotten every one of them hanged. When they signed the Declaration of Independence, they were not signing a certificate of victory. Actually, they were signing what amounted to a death warrant if the cause failed, because the British Crown considered them traitors, and traitors were executed. Again, that's not a metaphor. That was law, and yet they signed 56 of them. Let me tell you about a few of them, and maybe it's something you've never learned or heard before. A guy by the name of Richard Stockton. Now, he was a delegate from New Jersey. He was a prominent lawyer, and he was a signer of the Declaration. He was captured by the British, dragged from his bed in the middle of the night, thrown into a prison camp where he was nearly starved to death, and his health was permanently broken. His estate was looted and then burned. He died in 1781, just 5 years after signing the Declaration of Independence. He was a broken man, but he never recanted. He never took the loyalty oath to the crown. He held. How about a guy by the name of Francis Lewis? He was a New York delegate. Now, while he was away serving the Continental Congress, British soldiers came to his home in Long Island. They took his wife, and they imprisoned her without any charges, put her in a cell without a bed, and did not give her a change of clothes. She died not long after her release. Francis Lewis lost everything. He lost his property, his wife, all because he signed his name. How about John Hart from New Jersey? He was a signer. While he was away serving, the British came. His wife was on her deathbed. He had to flee into the woods and hide in caves and barns while his wife died and his 13 children scattered. He spent months as a fugitive on his own land. When the British finally left and he came home, there was almost nothing left. He died in 1779, exhausted and broken, never having recovered. Now, again, these are not just statistics. These are men. Men who had wives and children and farms and futures. And yet they chose liberty over their own personal safety. They chose to sign their names to a document that said, in the name of God and natural law and the rights of free men, we will not submit to tyranny. Now, here's what gets me. And here's what I want you to sit with. They did it for people they would never meet. They did it for us, for generations not yet born. They paid a price, and we've been cashing the checks for 250 years. So let me ask you, what are you willing to pay? And I'm not being dramatic here. I'm asking a real question, because the generation that is going to determine whether this republic survives the next 250 years is alive right now. It's you. It's me. It's the people listening to this program. And the question of what we are willing to sacrifice, what we are willing to stand up for, to speak up about, to show up for, is not a theoretical question. It's a question of our moment. Now, I said earlier that the founders treated 2 Chronicles 7:14 like a contract, like a covenant. I want to come back to that, because I think it's the key to understanding absolutely everything. A covenant is not just a contract, because a contract is transactional. I give this to you and you give that to me. And then it's complete, we're done. But a covenant is relational. It's binding. It carries obligations across generations. When God established a covenant with Abraham, he wasn't just making a deal with one man. He was establishing a relationship with a people that would extend through time. The Puritan founders, they understood this in their bones. John Winthrop, before he even stepped off the Arbella onto the shores of Massachusetts in 1630, he preached a sermon that has become one of the most famous in American history. He said, "We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world." A city on a hill. Does that sound familiar? It should. Jesus said it first. Sermon on the Mount. Winthrop was reaching back to Matthew 5 and applying it to what he believed God was doing in this new world. And it's because of being able to understand covenant that it provides that sense of being called, of being watched, or of being accountable to God for what is being built. In that sense, that mindset, it flowed through the founding generation like a river. Washington prayed at Valley Forge. Lincoln called for national days of fasting and prayer. The Congress opened with prayer from the very first session and has never stopped, because they understood that even when they could not fully articulate it theologically, they knew this nation was operating inside of a covenant. And that's the blessings that are not accidental. It's the blessings that could be forfeited. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 11 through 14. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Prosperity is the most dangerous spiritual condition a nation can be in. It's not suffering, it's not poverty, it's prosperity, because prosperity makes you think you did it yourself. In America, let's be honest, we have been extraordinarily prosperous. The most prosperous nation in the history of the world. And somewhere in the middle of all that prosperity, we started to believe our own press releases. We started to think that we built this. We started to forget that God gave it to us. Now, that's not a comfortable diagnosis, but it is the right one. So right now, as I record this, we are days away from July the 4th. Days from the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And the world, well, they're going to be watching America. There'll be fireworks and parades and speeches and concerts. There'll be celebrations from coast to coast. And most of those celebrations will completely ignore the foundation that made all of it possible. And that's not an accident. We'll talk about why in episode 3 of this 4-part series. But for today, focus on what you know. Focus on what you can do about it. Because here's the thing about moments like this. Anniversary moments, milestone moments. They're either wasted or redeemed. You can let the 250th go by as a reason to have your barbecues and your fireworks. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I hope you enjoy the fireworks. Or you can use it as a moment of reckoning. A moment to stop and ask the hard questions. Where did we come from? What were we built on? And what have we lost? And what is God calling us to do about it? Those are questions this series is designed to force. I want to give you 3 things very quickly as I'm running out of time that I'm going to challenge you to do this week. First, read the Declaration of Independence, the whole thing. Number 2, have a conversation with someone that is younger than you before the 4th, a teenager, young adult, whoever, and tell them one thing about America's Christian heritage that they don't know. Just one story. And then lastly, pray for this nation. I know that sounds simple, maybe too simple, but I want to challenge you to pray. Now, here's what I want to leave you with today. The faith that founded this nation was not just a decoration. It was not a cultural garnish. It was on top of some otherwise secular project. It was a load-bearing wall. It was the foundation. It was the thing without which none of the rest is held together. And we're living in a moment where that load-bearing wall is under assault and tremendous stress. It's not from foreign armies. It's from within, from a culture that has been systematically taught to be embarrassed by its own foundations. But embarrassment is a choice, and so is courage. The men and women of the founding generation were not superhuman. They were people who made a decision in a critical moment. They decided that what God had given them was worth protecting, worth sacrificing for, worth signing their names to. And here we are 250 years later. You and I are the heirs of that decision. We're living in the house they built. We're breathing the air of freedom they purchased, and they purchased with an enormous cost. The question for our generation is not whether America has a Christian heritage. She does. That's settled history. The question is whether we are going to talk about it, to own it, to defend it, and to pass it on. And I believe we can. I believe this is not the end of the story, but I also believe it requires us to awake. People who are informed, we have to talk about it. And that's what this series is going to be about. That's what this program has been about. Next episode, episode 2, we're going to look at what the founders actually built, the moral, legal framework of this republic. I'm going to be honest with you about what we've done with it, and it's going to be sobering, but you need to hear it. I'm Tom Sears. This is What's Important Now. As always, fight the good fight of faith, contend for the faith. There is a cause, it does matter, and it is important now. Until next time, take care.